My name is Detective Thomas Anderson, and I have been serving with the Boston Police Department for 18 years. In nearly 2 decades of investigating crimes, I have encountered every type of criminal imaginable. But sometimes, you meet someone whose story forces you to confront uncomfortable truths about class inequality, bullying, and the lasting damage that humiliation can inflict on a young mind. This is the story that David Clark told me 9 months ago, sitting in his maximum security prison cell where he is serving 5 consecutive life sentences for first-degree murder. When David first agreed to speak with me, I expected to hear another tale of senseless violence. Instead, I heard the methodical confession of a man whose childhood trauma had driven him to systematically destroy the lives of everyone who had humiliated him and his family. David Clark was 42 years old when he committed the murders that would define the rest of his life. But to understand why David became a killer, you have to understand the boy he once was and the systematic cruelty he endured during his formative years at Riverside Preparatory Academy, one of Boston's most exclusive private schools. David grew up in the working-class neighborhood of South Boston, the only child of Robert and Maria Clark. His father, Robert, worked double shifts at a textile factory, while his mother, Maria, cleaned office buildings at night to supplement their meager income. The Clark family lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment above a corner grocery store, barely making ends meet despite working nearly every waking hour. Detective Anderson David said, his voice filled with both pride and pain. My parents were the hardest working people you could ever imagine. My father would come home from the factory covered in lint and machine oil, exhausted, but he would still help me with my homework every night. My mother would work until 3 in the morning, cleaning offices, then wake up at 7 to make my breakfast and walk me to school. Despite their financial struggles, Robert and Maria Clark were determined to give their son opportunities they had never had. When David tested exceptionally well on standardized exams in 5th grade, his elementary school counselor told the family about scholarship opportunities at prestigious private schools in the area. David was academically gifted with a natural talent for mathematics and science that impressed his teachers. When Riverside Preparatory Academy offered him a full academic scholarship, Robert and Maria saw it as their son's ticket to a better life. They believed that attending an elite school would open doors that would otherwise remain forever closed to a working-class child. But what Robert and Maria could not have anticipated was how brutally their son would be treated by classmates who saw his presence at their exclusive school as an unwelcome intrusion into their privileged world. David entered Riverside Preparatory as a 12-year-old, 6th grader in September 1993. From his first day at the school, it was obvious that he did not belong to the same social class as his classmates. While other students arrived in luxury cars driven by chauffeurs or nannies, David took 3 different buses to reach the campus. While his classmates wore expensive designer clothing, David wore the same 5 outfits his mother had carefully selected from discount stores and thrift shops. The targeting began immediately, and it was led by 4 boys who would torment David for the next 6 years of his academic career. The ringleader was Christopher Wellington, whose father owned a chain of luxury hotels throughout New England. Christopher's main accomplices were Bradley Morrison, whose mother was a prominent judge, Marcus Sterling, whose family controlled a major investment banking firm, and Tyler Blackwood, whose father was a successful real estate developer. These boys had grown up together, attending the same exclusive prep school since kindergarten. They came from families where wealth and social status were not just advantages, but defining characteristics of their identity. To them, David represented something foreign and threatening, a reminder that merit alone might be more valuable than inherited privilege. The bullying started with small, cruel acts designed to make David feel like an outsider. They would move his backpack while he was in class, forcing him to search for it and arrive late to his next period. They would spread rumors that he smelled bad or that his family was too poor to afford soap. They would deliberately exclude him from group projects and social activities, making sure he understood that he was not welcome in their social circle. But as the months passed, the harassment escalated into more serious and systematic cruelty. Christopher and his friends discovered that David brought his lunch from home in a brown paper bag while they purchased expensive meals from the school cafeteria. They began targeting his lunch daily, knocking it out of his hands, spitting in his food, or stealing it entirely and throwing it away. David would often go hungry during school hours because his family could not afford to give him money for cafeteria meals, and his tormentors had destroyed the food his mother had carefully packed for him each morning. When David tried to eat quickly to avoid harassment, they would mock him for eating like an animal, or make loud comments about poor people being desperate for food. Detective Anderson David told me his mother would pack my lunch with such care. She would make me sandwiches, cut them into perfect triangles, and include little notes, telling me to have a good day. Watching those boys throw away the food she had prepared with so much love was devastating. I knew how hard she worked for every dollar, and seeing her efforts literally thrown in the trash made me feel helpless and angry. The physical bullying began during David's second year at Riverside. Prep Christopher and his friends would push David in the hallways, trip him on staircases, and shove him into lockers when teachers were not watching. They were careful to make their attacks look accidental or playful so that any adult who witnessed the incidents would dismiss them as normal roughhousing between boys. But the psychological torture was far more damaging than the physical abuse. The four boys made sure that David understood every day that he did not belong at their school and that his presence was an insult to their exclusive community. They would make loud comments about scholarship students taking spots away from deserving wealthy children. They would joke about how David's parents probably cleaned the bathrooms that the rich kids used. The worst incident occurred during David's sophomore year when the school held its annual parent fundraising gala. Maria Clark attended the event, working as part of the catering staff hired to serve food and drinks to the wealthy families who could afford to donate thousands of dollars to the school's endowment fund. Christopher Wellington spotted Maria working at the event and realized she was David's mother. He gathered his three friends, and they began making loud comments within earshot of other parents about how pathetic it was that some families were so desperate for their children to attend Riverside that the mothers had to work as servants at school functions. David Anderson. David said, tears streaming down his face as he relived the memory. I was standing right there when they started talking about my mother. They said she looked like a typical cleaning lady and joked about whether she was qualified to handle the expensive china and crystal. They made comments about hoping she would not steal anything since poor people could not be trusted around valuable items. Maria Clark had dedicated her life to giving her son opportunities for a better future. She worked 2 jobs, cleaned offices until the early morning hours, and sacrificed every luxury so that David could attend the best school possible. Watching wealthy teenagers mock her appearance and question her integrity while she served them food was a humiliation that cut deeper than any physical violence. David wanted to defend his mother, but he knew that any confrontation would result in his expulsion from Riverside Prep. He stood silently watching the woman who had sacrificed everything for him being ridiculed by boys whose families had never known a day of financial hardship. That night when Maria came home from the gala, she found David crying in his bedroom. She sat beside him and stroked his hair the way she had done when he was a small child. Mijo Maria said, using the Spanish nickname she had called him since birth. What happened at the school? Tonight I saw how those boys were looking at you, and I could tell something was wrong. David could not bring himself to tell his mother exactly what Christopher and his friends had said about her. Instead, he simply told her that some of the other students had made comments about scholarship students not belonging at Riverside. Maria was quiet for a long time before she spoke again. David, she said, you do not have to stay at that school if the other children are making you unhappy. Your father and I will find another way to give you a good education. No scholarship is worth having your spirit broken by cruel people. But David could not bear the thought of his parents' sacrifices being wasted. He knew how much they had given up to support his education, and he was determined to graduate from Riverside Prep no matter what it cost him emotionally. I will be fine, Mama, David told her. I just need to focus on my studies and ignore the other kids. In a few more years, I will graduate, and none of this will matter anymore. But David was wrong. The humiliation and cruelty he endured at Riverside Prep would matter for the rest of his life, shaping his worldview and creating a thirst for revenge that would eventually consume everything in its path. The bullying continued relentlessly throughout David's remaining years at the school. Christopher, Bradley, Marcus, and Tyler made sure that every day brought new humiliation and reminded David that he would never be accepted by their social class. They mocked his clothes, his accent, his family's occupation, and his scholarship status with creative cruelty that left lasting psychological scars. During his senior year, the four boys orchestrated their most devastating attack yet. They discovered that Maria Clark cleaned the office building where Christopher's father conducted business, and they arranged for her to be fired by spreading false rumors about theft and unreliability. Maria lost her job just 3 months before David's graduation, making it difficult for the family to pay their rent and utilities. David knew that his tormentors were responsible for his mother's unemployment, but he had no way to prove their involvement or seek justice through legitimate channels. At Riverside Prep's graduation ceremony, David watched Christopher, Bradley, Marcus, and Tyler celebrate their acceptance to Ivy League universities while he prepared to attend a local state college on financial aid. These boys had been handed every advantage in life, while David had fought for every opportunity despite their constant attempts to destroy his confidence and derail his education. As David walked across the stage to receive his diploma, he made a silent promise that would define the rest of his life. Someday he would make these four boys pay for what they had done to him and his family. Someday they would understand what it felt like to be powerless and humiliated and desperate. Detective Anderson, David said, looking directly at me with eyes that still held the pain of that 18-year-old boy. I graduated from Riverside Prep with honors, despite everything they did to me. But I also graduated with something else that would shape my future, a burning need to prove that the poor kid they had tormented was stronger and smarter and more determined than any of them. David enrolled at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where he studied business and finance with the single-minded focus of someone who understood that success would be his only form of revenge. He worked multiple jobs to pay for his education, lived in the cheapest housing he could find, and devoted every spare moment to his studies. While Christopher, Bradley, Marcus, and Tyler enjoyed fraternity parties and expensive spring break vacations, David was building the knowledge and skills he would need to destroy their privileged lives. He studied their families, businesses, learned about their financial vulnerabilities, and began planning a campaign of revenge that would take more than 20 years to execute. David graduated summa cum laude from college and went on to earn an MBA from a respected graduate program. He started his own investment firm, specializing in identifying undervalued companies and turning them into profitable enterprises. Within 10 years, he had built a multi-million-dollar business empire and had gained the wealth and influence he needed to begin his revenge. But David did not just want to surpass his former tormentors financially. He wanted to destroy them completely, to make them feel the same helplessness and humiliation they had inflicted on him and his family during his formative years. He wanted them to understand that actions have consequences, and that the poor boy they had underestimated had become more powerful than any of them. Detective Anderson, David said, his voice taking on the cold, calculated tone that characterized all of his planning. I spent 23 years preparing for my revenge. I built my business empire, not just for personal success, but as a weapon to be used against the people who had destroyed my childhood and humiliated my family. Every dollar I earned, every connection I made, every skill I developed was ultimately in service of making them pay for what they had done. By 2019, David Clark had become one of Boston's most successful businessmen with a net worth exceeding $50 million. He owned a mansion in Beacon Hill, drove luxury cars, and moved in the same elite social circles that had rejected him as a child. But unlike his former classmates, David's wealth had been earned through intelligence, hard work, and determination, rather than inherited privilege. More importantly, David had spent years learning everything there was to know about Christopher, Bradley, Marcus, and Tyler. He knew their business interests, their financial vulnerabilities, their personal relationships, and their deepest fears. He had been patient, methodical, and thorough in his preparation, because he understood that he would only get one chance to destroy them completely. The time for revenge had finally come, and David Clark was ready to show four wealthy bullies that the poor boy they had tormented had grown up to be their worst nightmare. David's revenge began with Christopher Wellington, the ringleader who had orchestrated most of the cruelty David had endured at Riverside Prep. By 2019, Christopher had inherited his father's hotel chain and was living the privileged lifestyle he had always taken for granted. He owned multiple properties, drove expensive cars, and had never worked a day in his life for anything he possessed. But Christopher's business empire was built on inherited wealth rather than sound financial management, and David had identified serious vulnerabilities in the Wellington Hotel Group's financial structure. The company was over-leveraged with massive debts secured by properties that were declining in value, and Christopher lacked the business acumen to address these problems effectively. Detective Anderson, David told me, his voice taking on the methodical tone he used when discussing his planning. Christopher was exactly what you would expect from someone who had never earned anything through his own efforts. He was arrogant, lazy, and completely dependent on advisors who were more interested in collecting fees than protecting his interests. David began his attack on Christopher's empire by acquiring distressed debt that was secured by Wellington Hotel properties. He used shell companies and intermediaries to hide his involvement, ensuring that Christopher would not realize who was orchestrating his downfall until it was too late to fight back effectively. Over the course of 18 months, David systematically acquired control of the financial instruments that kept Christopher's business empire afloat. He bought defaulted loans for closed-on properties and used his superior knowledge of finance law to trap Christopher in a web of legal and financial obligations that would be impossible to escape. The process was slow and methodical because David wanted Christopher to experience the same gradual erosion of hope that David had felt. During his years at Riverside Prep, he wanted Christopher to watch his inherited privilege disappear piece by piece, understanding that he was powerless to stop the destruction of everything he had taken for granted. As Christopher's financial situation deteriorated, he was forced to sell his luxury cars, mortgage his personal residence, and eventually declare bankruptcy. The Wellington Hotel Group collapsed, taking with it 3 generations of family wealth and leaving Christopher with massive personal debts that would take decades to repay. But David was not satisfied with simply destroying Christopher's financial empire. He wanted Christopher to experience the kind of personal humiliation that David had endured as a scholarship student. David arranged for Christopher to be evicted from his mansion and forced to move into a small apartment in the same working-class neighborhood where David had grown up. David also used his business connections to ensure that Christopher would be unable to find employment in the hospitality industry or any other field where his family name had once carried weight. Christopher Wellington went from being a multi-millionaire hotel owner to working minimum wage jobs and struggling to pay rent, just as David's family had struggled during his childhood. The final step in Christopher's destruction came when David arranged for him to be hired as a janitor at the office building where David's investment firm was located. Christopher was forced to clean the offices and bathrooms used by the man he had once tormented, ensuring that he understood exactly how complete his fall from grace had been. Detective Anderson, David said with cold satisfaction, "I wanted Christopher to know that the poor boy he had mocked for 6 years had become his employer. I wanted him to experience the humiliation of cleaning up after people who looked down on him, just as he had looked down on my mother when she worked as part of the catering staff at school events." David's second target was Bradley Morrison, the son of the prominent judge who had participated enthusiastically in the bullying at Riverside Prep. Bradley had followed his mother into the legal profession, becoming a successful attorney who specialized in representing wealthy clients in high-stakes civil litigation. Bradley's law firm, Morrison, Hartwell and Associates, was highly respected and extremely profitable, but David's investigation revealed that Bradley had been engaging in unethical practices that could destroy his career if exposed to the proper authorities. Bradley had been billing clients for work performed by junior associates, while claiming credit for their research, and had been manipulating billing records to inflate his fees. More seriously, Bradley had been providing legal advice to clients while having undisclosed financial interests in the outcomes of their cases. He had been investing in companies involved in litigation his firm was handling, creating conflicts of interest that violated multiple professional ethics rules and state laws. David gathered comprehensive evidence of Bradley's professional misconduct, using private investigators and forensic accountants to document every violation in detail. But instead of immediately reporting Bradley to the State Bar Association, David decided to use this information as leverage to destroy Bradley's life more systematically. David began by anonymously providing information about Bradley's misconduct to investigative journalists who specialized in exposing corruption in the legal system. The resulting news coverage was devastating, painting Bradley as a corrupt attorney who had defrauded clients and violated his professional obligations for personal gain. As the scandal grew, Bradley lost major clients, faced multiple lawsuits from former clients who claimed they had been overcharged, and was eventually suspended from practicing law pending a full investigation by the State Bar Association. His law firm collapsed, his partners abandoned him, and his reputation in the legal community was destroyed permanently. But David was not finished with Bradley. He used his business connections to ensure that Bradley would be unable to find work in any law firm in Massachusetts or any other state. Bradley Morrison went from being a successful attorney earning hundreds of thousands of dollars per year to being unemployed and unemployable in the field he had spent decades building his career in. The personal destruction continued when David orchestrated Bradley's divorce by providing Bradley's wife with evidence of his financial misconduct and hidden assets. Bradley lost his home, his savings, and his access to his children as his ex-wife moved across the country to escape the scandal that surrounded his name. Bradley Morrison ended up working at a call center for minimum wage, living in a studio apartment, and struggling with depression and alcoholism that stemmed from his complete fall from professional and social grace. David's third target was Marcus Sterling, whose family controlled a major investment banking firm. Marcus had inherited a position at Sterling Investment Group and lived off the wealth generated by a business empire built by previous generations of his family. Marcus was perhaps the most vulnerable of David's targets because his lifestyle far exceeded his actual business skills or work ethic. He spent most of his time at exclusive country clubs, expensive restaurants, and luxury resorts while contributing very little to the daily operations of the family business. David's attack on Marcus began with a series of bad investment recommendations that David fed to him through intermediaries and false information sources. David used his knowledge of market manipulation and financial analysis to create artificial opportunities that seemed profitable but were actually designed to lose money. Over the course of 2 years, Marcus made increasingly large investments in ventures that David had specifically designed to fail. Marcus borrowed against his family's assets to fund these investments, believing that he was positioned to make enormous profits that would establish his reputation as a brilliant financier. Instead, Marcus lost over $30 million of his family's money and destroyed the reputation of Sterling Investment Group in the process. The family business that had taken 3 generations to build was destroyed by Marcus's incompetence and greed, leaving the Sterling family with massive debts and no viable way to recover their losses. Marcus faced lawsuits from investors who had trusted his judgment, financial ruin that forced him to declare bankruptcy, and the complete destruction of his family's social standing in Boston's elite community. The Sterling family went from being one of the most respected names in Boston finance to being regarded as cautionary tale about the dangers of inherited wealth and unearned privilege. Marcus Sterling lost his mansion, his country club memberships, his luxury cars, and his position in the social circles where he had once been treated as royalty. He was forced to move in with relatives and take a job as a retail sales clerk, earning less in a year than he had once spent on a single vacation. David's final target was Tyler Blackwood, whose father had been a successful real estate developer. Tyler had inherited multiple properties throughout Boston and lived as a landlord, collecting rent from tenants while contributing nothing productive to the community. Tyler was perhaps the most arrogant and entitled of David's former tormentors, believing that his inherited wealth made him superior to people who actually worked for their money. He treated his tenants with contempt, raised rents without making necessary repairs, and used his wealth to avoid consequences for his negligent property management. David's revenge against Tyler was the most personal and creative of all his attacks. David used his business empire to systematically acquire every property that Tyler owned, either through direct purchase or by foreclosing on the mortgages that secured Tyler's real estate investments. The process took 3 years and cost David over $20 million, but the result was exactly what he had planned. Tyler Blackwood went from being a wealthy property owner to being homeless and destitute, without any source of income or assets to fall back on. But David was not satisfied with simply destroying Tyler financially. He wanted Tyler to experience the same kind of housing insecurity and dependence on others that David's family had faced during his childhood when they struggled to pay rent and utilities. David arranged for Tyler to be hired as a maintenance worker at one of the apartment buildings that David now owned. Tyler was forced to clean garbage disposal, units repair, broken toilets, and perform the kind of manual labor that he had always believed was beneath his social status. Tyler Blackwood, who had once mocked David for being the son of a factory worker and a cleaning lady, now spent his days unclogging sewers and scrubbing floors for the man he had tormented during their school years. Detective Anderson, David said with evident satisfaction, "I wanted all 4 of them to understand exactly what it felt like to lose everything they had taken for granted. I wanted them to experience the humiliation of being dependent on others for their survival, just as my family had been dependent on my scholarship to Riverside Prep." By 2022, David had successfully destroyed the lives of all 4 men who had tormented him during his school years. Christopher Wellington was working as a janitor in David's office building. Bradley Morrison was unemployed and struggling with addiction. Marcus Sterling was working retail and living with relatives. Tyler Blackwood was cleaning sewers and living in poverty. But David's thirst for revenge was not yet satisfied. He had destroyed their financial security and social status, but he wanted them to experience the same kind of physical fear and helplessness that he had felt when they pushed him in hallways and knocked his lunch out of his hands. David began stalking each of his victims, learning their routines and planning attacks that would terrorize them while avoiding detection by law enforcement. He wanted them to understand that their destruction had been deliberate and personal, not just a series of unfortunate business decisions or professional failures. The murders began in January 2023 when David lured Christopher Wellington to a meeting at an abandoned warehouse under the pretense of offering him a better job. David had prepared extensively for this confrontation, purchasing untraceable weapons and studying forensic techniques that would help him avoid leaving evidence. When Christopher arrived at the warehouse, David revealed his identity and explained exactly why Christopher's life had been systematically destroyed over the previous 4 years. Christopher finally understood that his financial ruin had been orchestrated by the scholarship student he had tormented at Riverside Prep. Before killing Christopher, David forced him to relive every incident of cruelty he had inflicted during their school years. David made Christopher acknowledge the pain he had caused and apologize for the humiliation he had brought to David's family. Christopher Wellington died, understanding that his arrogance and cruelty as a teenager had consequences that lasted far beyond graduation. David killed him slowly and methodically, ensuring that Christopher experienced the same helplessness that David had felt as a child. The other 3 murders followed similar patterns. David lured each victim to isolated locations, confronted them with evidence of their past cruelty, and forced them to understand that their current suffering was payment for sins they had committed decades earlier. Bradley Morrison, Marcus Sterling, and Tyler Blackwood all died knowing that the poor boy they had underestimated had grown up to become their destroyer. David made sure each of them understood exactly why they were being killed and what their teenage cruelty had ultimately cost them. Detective Anderson, David said during our final interview, "People ask me if I regret what I did to those 4 men. The honest answer is no. They destroyed my childhood, humiliated my family, and taught me that wealth and privilege could be used as weapons against people who had done nothing wrong." David paused, looking at the concrete walls of his prison cell. "I spent 23 years building the success I needed to destroy them, and I accomplished exactly what I set out to do. They experienced the same powerlessness and humiliation they had inflicted on me, and they paid the ultimate price for their cruelty. David looked directly at me, his eyes still filled with the pain of the bullied child he had once been. My only regret, Detective Anderson, is that my mother died before she could see how successful I became. She never got to see the poor boy she had sacrificed everything for, become wealthy and powerful enough to make his tormentors pay for what they had done to our family. As our interview concluded, I found myself grappling with questions that have no easy answers. David Clark had committed 4 brutal murders and destroyed the lives of people who had families and loved ones who mourned their deaths. But those 4 men had also committed cruel acts during their teenage years, systematically tormenting a vulnerable child and humiliating his hardworking mother for no reason other than their own sense of entitlement and superiority. David Clark sits in prison today, serving 4 consecutive life sentences for murders he has never denied committing. He spends his days reading business journals and writing detailed plans for companies he will never own. The case of David Clark serves as a stark reminder that childhood cruelty can have consequences that last for decades, and that the pain inflicted on young people by bullies and classmates can shape their entire approach to life and relationships. Sometimes the quiet kids who endure humiliation and abuse grow up to become successful adults who never forget the people who made their formative years miserable. And sometimes that success becomes a weapon used to settle scores that most people assumed had been forgotten. David Clark was a brilliant student who could have used his talents to build a better world. Instead, he used them to destroy the people who had made his childhood a nightmare. The poor boy who had been mocked and humiliated at an elite private school had grown up to become something far more dangerous than his tormentors ever imagined. If this story affected you, please subscribe to our channel for more true crime confessions that explore how childhood trauma can shape adult behavior. Next week, we will hear from a woman who discovered her husband's secret and made a choice that destroyed both their lives. Until then, remember that the children we are cruel to today may grow up to be the adults who seek revenge tomorrow.